We were in a hurry. We had just a couple of hours to get the rest of the house packed up. As we were preparing to head off to seminary, our house sold faster than we thought it would, so we had to get our stuff into boxes and into storage so we could close on the house. Now, we had never moved our whole household with the little ones by ourselves before, so we weren't practiced at it yet. And as the time to be out of the house was getting closer and closer, we realized the refrigerator still hadn't been emptied, and we had some other boxes yet to fill up. And so whatever was around just went into a box. So the silverware that we used every day went into the bottom of the box, and then into the top of that box went some stuff off a nearby bookshelf, including my little Albert Einstein head that I used as a bookend. So we got it all done, we got it put into storage. 6 weeks later, we traveled off to the seminary, we got to our townhouse there and unpacked everything, and we couldn't find the silverware. We looked in every box, including the box that we would open and see Albert Einstein looking up at us, along with other things from the bookshelves. And 6 weeks off that frantic, we didn't remember putting it in that box, so we would open that box and say, oh, nope, that's bookshelf stuff, and put the lid right back on and put it away, and then look in every other box again, some of which we dug deeply because it did have kitchen stuff. 2 years later, we moved to Colorado for internship. Looked in every box again, still couldn't find the silverware. We looked at Albert Einstein again and said, nope, that's all stuff from the bookshelf we don't have space to unpack for. 2 years after that, we moved back to the seminary, looked in every box again. We were sure it was somewhere, but we're beginning to think maybe that we had lost it. 5 years from the day it went into the box, we were finally arrived in Tampa for our first call, and as we unpacked some boxes, Laura said, I found the silverware! It was underneath Albert Einstein and the rest of the stuff from the bookshelves. 5 years we were looking in the wrong places, and even when we looked in the right place, we did not look deep enough to find that silverware. For the next 7 weeks, we're going to journey through Ephesians and see what Ephesians has to say about having a full life. And by full, I mean that in a positive sense. Some of you feel like your life is plentiful of busyness and distractions and pain and struggle. Not that kind of fullness, right? It's the fullness that we think of when we maybe long for a life that has meaning and purpose and whatever other ways we might use to describe what a full life looks like. And today I would suggest to you that a full life, one of the components of it, I think, has to be hope. Because as human beings, we live with enough struggle and pain and disappointment that there has to be some hope that there is more than what it is we're living through right now. Now, hope is a tricky concept. I might look at you today and say, gosh, I hope it rains later, because my garden, my little tiny garden that has basically a basil plant, really needs some water. So I hope that it rains. I might say, I hope that the movie I want to go see later this week is a good movie. That's one way that we use the word hope, and what we're saying is that there's a future kind of event or outcome that we're wishing will happen. There was a guy in the 20th century named Studs Terkel who was an interviewer of people, and he would draw out of people their stories and record them. Sometimes he wrote books. One of those books he wrote was called Hope Dies Last. And just the title gives you the sense that sometimes life can get so overwhelming that the only thing you have left is a hope that somehow it will get better. Is that the same thing as hoping that it will rain later? Totally different, right? It's an idea that there can be more than what there is now, better than what there is now, richer, fuller life than what there is now. And that is the kind of hope, I think, that has to be part of a full life. Now, the question is, do we find hope in the right places, or do we do like we did and look in all of the wrong boxes for hope, and when we do find the right box, not really dig deep enough? When I think about my own journey, I have put my hope in all kinds of places. This week, we had a Supreme Court justice nominated, and there are a whole group of people that have hope now that what they have spent their whole lives fighting for will now come to realization because there's a different balance in the court. I have put hope in elections before, whether it's for a mayor or a president, some anywhere in between, that there will be policies that come out different. I once had a man in his 70s sit in my office and just weep because we were approaching the second election of President Obama, and he was certain that that was going to bring ruin to the world. So his hope was in a different result, right? And so I have put my hope in those places, and I would bet that most of us have put our hope in an election, or even not in an election. Maybe you've given up all hope in our politicians, but you still hope in democracy, that it is the greatest way we have figured out as people to govern ourselves, and somehow democracy will lead us to that place of more. I've also at times put my hope in economics, that if the economics were just better, things would be more, life would be fuller if there was just more money and more economic health that was around. That worked really well until you sit with people who were trying to figure out how to walk away from their house. My grandparents lost a farm to bankruptcy, right? So hoping in the economy doesn't always pan out. There are times where I have put hope in safety and security. And in our nation, that sometimes looks like military might, in the ways that we think if we can just protect ourselves, then things will be full and whole. There are times where we put our hope in medical outcomes. We hope that the doctor will give us a different answer than, yes, you're getting older, you're not stuck with that. And those kind of things, right? And whether it's a relationship or a treatment program or an exercise regimen, whatever it is, there are all sorts of places that we can put our hope that when we live into that reality, life will be more. Now, the thing is, often that works, at least for a period of time. Our policies and our laws and the things that our politicians do impact people. Sometimes for the good and sometimes for the bad. So when we put some level of hope there, we are putting hope in something that can make a difference in our lives. If we put our hope in a medical treatment, sometimes it actually works and we get healed. If we put our hope in the economy, sometimes it goes really well, and it does help us as we look at retirements and other things. So all of this matters. All of it makes a difference in our lives. But also, we know that sometimes it doesn't. Right? If you look at the political side of things, one person's hope is another person's despair. If you look at the healthcare part of it, sometimes somebody gets cured and often people don't. And so the question then becomes, if we're putting our hope in these things that so often let us down, is there a different box we ought to be looking in for hope? Hope that doesn't disappoint. Because if it can't be hope for everybody all the time, then I'm not really sure it is hope at all. It might be wishing. It might be some kind of maybe a middle ground of hope. Like, I can hope that it's going to rain. I can hope that the economy gets better. But there must be a further hope that is bigger than all of it. And that is what we hear about in Ephesians this morning. The opening of the letter to the Ephesians is very high and lofty in its kind of language and the way that it talks about our relationship with God. It starts off by saying that before the foundations of the world were even created, God chose us, God's people. It ends with talking about the seal of the Holy Spirit, which is what we do at baptism. So God chose us before the foundations of the earth to be holy and blameless. Does that sound pretty good? And if we got chosen before we were even created, that puts us off on a pretty good foot to begin with. Then as the letter goes on, it talks about that all of these gifts we have been given, and it talks about some of those gifts. Redemption. And in scriptures, when it's talking about redemption, it usually is the idea that a slave gets redeemed out of slavery. So redemption is that we've been freed from slavery to sin. Salvation is this idea that we get reconnected with God and in a right way. All of this, it says, is a free gift of grace that comes through Jesus. So far, so good, right? We've got God creating this thing. We are holy and blameless. Jesus gives us this gift of life freely. And then it gets to my favorite part. It says that in the fullness of time, or for the fullness of time, God had a plan. Now, we're talking about what it means to have a full life. The fullness of time is sort of the achieving all that God intended for all of time to be kind of come to its culmination. Now, often when we talk about God's plan, we talk about it like God is a chess player moving us around from thing to thing. But that's not what it says in Ephesians. It says God had a plan for the fullness of time, and that plan was for all of creation to get gathered up into God. Not a plan for just the people that did the good things to get gathered up in God. Not a plan for just the people of a certain religion to get gathered up into God. Not a plan for just the people to get gathered up into God. But a plan for all of creation to get gathered up into God. And generally when Scripture says all, I assume that it means all. pretty amazing. That Jesus' job to come was to live in this world and to die, and in that new life he comes into to drag the whole of creation into God's grace. That sounds like something to put some hope in, because it's not going to disappoint. Right? If I put my hope in a political outcome, I'm going to be disappointed. If I put my hope in a medical outcome, I'm going to be disappointed. If I put my hope in economics, I'm going to be disappointed. But if Jesus is coming to get each and every one of us and the whole of creation, ultimately that's a promise that won't disappoint. Now the hard part is we live in between now and the fullness of time. So if this is God's plan for the fullness of time and we are not all the way there yet, we have to have hope. And as the letter goes on, that's what it says about the particular group of baptized people that the letter was addressed to. It says, we, who were the first to put our hope in Jesus, are now to live to the glory of God. This to me is an instruction about how we live in this gift of grace that we have been given of life. That we are in between Jesus' death and his resurrection into life, and the fullness of time where all of us get gathered fully up into God. So what does it mean then to live with hope in that in-between space? Well, if our hope is in these promises that don't disappoint, how did we get that hope? I don't think any of us sat down and read Ephesians at one point and said, oh, that's where my hope should be. I'm going to stop looking at all the rest of these boxes and just sit there and have my hope be there. No, I think it comes from actually witnessing death and resurrection. It comes from seeing people who go through horrible experiences and come out the other end with some sense of new life. For me, that has meant getting to know people who have lived through addiction and come to a place where they have a new life after that. Sometimes it is healing that feels miraculous. Other times it's not healing, but it is living into death with some grace and some compassion and all that goes with that, because Jesus' death and resurrection even conquers death. But the more that we witness resurrection among us in this world, the more that we have hope that this promise that we get from Jesus is true. So if we're the ones that in baptism are the first to see those promises and the first to hope in those promises and the ones that cling to those promises, that is where our hope then is, not in those other places that ultimately disappoint ourselves. So then what is our task? Well, when we opened up this box and saw little Albert Einstein looking up to us, he's just a statue, but if he could talk, and if he had said, hey, the silver is underneath the rest of the stuff in this box, we would have found it a lot faster, right? We wouldn't have gone 5 years without our silverware. We would have found it just then. So imagine ourselves as people of faith. If we have hope in Jesus and hope in these promises of resurrection, and we trust that this gift of life they've been given is as amazing as it sounds because we've seen it in glimpses, if we're like statues and don't talk about that at all, how are people who haven't yet found hope going to know where to look for it? But if instead we learn how to talk about our hope and tell our stories of death and resurrection and tell of the things that we've witnessed of death and resurrection, then when other people are looking for hope in all of the wrong places, they might stumble across the box and open it up and find us there, and we say, hey, here it is. It's not easy to understand. It's not easy to see. You might not experience right away, but this is where our hope is. There's a part of 1 Peter that says we should always be ready to give an accounting of the hope that is within us. And that hope that is within us comes from the stories and the experiences that we have of God's grace in our lives. And the thing about that is this box was with us the whole time. We never lost it. It was always right there. Jesus' love and grace is with us all the time. Even we lose track of that sometimes, but collectively we as a whole can remind one another and point to that hope so that this world around us that is part of the plan of the fullness of time to get gathered up can know that this thing that is with us all the time is indeed a gift of life. It is freely given, and it is the place we can put our hope. And may we be blessed to be the lights and the little Einsteins that speak to that hope so that people can see it and experience it and know it in the ways that we have. Amen.